is take leadership. Take a leadership role in this debate. Stand up to his base and encourage his party to take real steps to reduce the deficit. I'm not going to hold my breath. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of the quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Who's up next?
Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming. The Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, how much time is left, may I inquire, on the Republican side?
13 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just follow my colleague from Utah who talked about getting the President engaged in these discussions. Mr. President, I noticed a large story, Thursday's New York Times, the headline, "President on Sidelines in Critical Battle Over Debt Ceiling." President on the sidelines. Mr. President, we are at a time where we are facing the largest threat to our national security, and we cannot have the President on the sidelines. And when I talk about the single largest threat to our national security, not talking about a terrorist organization, not talking about wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, not talking about natural disasters, disease, epidemics, not famine. I'm talking about our national debt. Our national debt is the threat. It is the greatest threat to our national security. I'll tell you, this isn't a problem for one party, the other party. It is a problem for all of us as Americans. Now, I'm not the only one that's saying it. Actually, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, has said the most significant threat to our nation's security is our debt. Let me repeat, the most significant threat to our national security is the debt. You may notice, Mr. President, that Admiral Mullen makes no mention at all of the debt ceiling.
Would the Senator from Wyoming cease for a minute? Could we have order, please?
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming may continue.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as I was saying, you will note that Admiral Mullen makes no mention at all of a debt ceiling. He is talking specifically about the debt. And he is doing that because the debt ceiling isn't the problem. Our national debt is the threat. $14 trillion of debt, and it continues to grow. We are borrowing every day over $4 billion. That's over $2 million every minute, Mr. President. You say, where does the money come from? Well, of the money we spent last year in this country, over 41 cents of every dollar we spent, over 41 cents of every dollar is borrowed money. A lot of it from foreign countries, and specifically from China. How do we stay a strong and independent leader of the world if you owe that kind of debt to anyone, especially to another country who may not have your own best interests at heart? The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff clearly understands this. But it's not just our military leaders that understand it, Mr. President. Families and business owners all across Wyoming understand it. And the American people understand it. We all know what the American people want. They want cuts to spending now. They want to control spending in the future. And they want accountability. And they sure don't believe they're getting it out of Washington. Mr. President, I received an email this week from a gentleman from my hometown of Casper, and looked at this whole thing, and he said, you know, the fact that the debt ceiling needs to be raised is where the problem lies. This is a systematic problem, he says, that will either be fixed or it will eventually destroy this nation. He said, I urge you to stand strong and oppose any spending that exceeds revenue, using the debt ceiling. He says, we, your constituents, understand this could be a painful path, could lead to economic problems. My forefathers put their lives at risk to prevent this kind of idiocy that the federal government has become. He's talking about a debt of $14 trillion. He says, every one of my family members and neighbors is prepared to weather the storm now to prevent future catastrophe. You know, my friends on the other side of the aisle, they're focused on the debt ceiling. It seems to me that they have lost sight of the real problem, and that problem is the debt. Instead of working toward a higher debt ceiling, we need to be discussing ways to get our fiscal feet back on the floor, to get our fiscal house in order, and to provide the accountability that the American people want. I listened to the President's address to the nation last Monday night. It seemed to be more of a campaign speech than an address about the issues that are facing this country. There was blaming going on. Seemed to me scare tactics, class warfare. He used the phrase balanced about 7 times. He kept talking about a balanced approach. Americans don't want a balanced approach. They want a balanced budget. They want a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. That's the way we do it in Wyoming. That's the way many states do it. Live within our means. Balance the budget year after year after year. There is a lesson that Washington could learn from so many states around the country. Live within your means every year. The American people want us to seek a real solution. They want a real solution that provides them with the peace of mind to know they will not be subjected to this sort of activity on a repeated basis. They want the peace of mind as well as the economic security that they believe as Americans, is a basis for this great country. They're looking for a solution that recognizes that the current system in Washington is broken, and they're looking for a solution that says we realize that we need to take immediate action to fix it. Why is it broken? Why do we need immediate action? Well, it's broken because we have failed to live within our means for so very long. It's also broken, Mr. President, because this body, the United States Senate, has not had a budget for over 800 days. Over 800 days, there has not been a budget in the United States Senate. One brought forth by the President failed, got no votes. No votes. 97 people voted against it. 97 people voted against it. Not one Democrat voted for the President's budget. Not one. It seems to be broken, Mr. President, because Washington is more focused on short-term political gain instead of the long-term consequences of our actions. And we saw that a little earlier with the discussions on the Senate floor. I'm ready to vote on the proposal on the Senate floor. The minority leader recommended a vote immediately, and yet it was objected to by the majority leader. You know, since the beginning of this entire debate, I've had a very clear bottom line. We need to avoid defaulting on our debt, and implement the spending controls to get our finances back in order. Now, what's the President's bottom line? Well, the President said it, and I quote. He said, "The only bottom line I have," he said, "the only bottom line I have is that we have to extend this debt ceiling through the next election," he said, into 2013. President's only bottom line: ignore and avoid the biggest threat to our national security until after the next election. Mr. President, contrary to what the President wants, we cannot ignore and we cannot avoid this issue until after the next election. People all across the country are worried about their jobs. They're worried about the economy. They're worried about the debt, and they are worried about the spending. The American people want us to take action today. They want us to cut costs. They want us to control spending. They want us to enforce accountability across every branch of the federal government. They would like us to put progress ahead of partisanship. They want us to put people before the politics. The decisions that must be made aren't easy for either party. This isn't about Democrats, Republicans, independents. It's about America. It's about this country. People all across the country, and I've been in my office since early this morning, and we've been answering the phones. And what I'm hearing is what you all should be hearing if you're answering your phones. Enough is enough. Enough is enough. That's what the American people are saying. We are now at the 11th hour, and we must not lose sight of our goal. It is important, it's more important to find a real solution than it is to settle for a quick compromise. And so I look at some of these letters and calls and emails that have been coming in. One from Pinedale, Wyoming, said it is better to bite a small bullet now than a cannon shell later on. You know, that's a Wyoming way of talking. Bite a small bullet now rather than a cannon shell later on. From Pinedale, Wyoming. A couple from Casper. Different emails. This country is in dire financial straits. And this person says, since I work for the federal government, I have more to lose than most Americans, but I don't want to give this administration a blank check. Someone who works for the federal government. I don't want to give this administration a blank check. We have to get this country back on track to fiscal responsibility, and this is the open debate. They go on. I realize that my job could be cut just to get there, but the national debt is too large to ignore. This is a Wyoming person talking, putting the country in front of the politics, putting the country in front of themselves. Go on to say we must get it under control or there is more to lose than just our jobs. The economic consequences of not getting this under control will devastate this country years down the road. We have to start now before it's too late. And then another from a woman in Casper. She said it is time to cut up the federal government's credit card. The current debt situation is an insult to all of us who live within our means. People of the country live within their means. States that balance their budget every year live within their means. It is time for Washington to live within its means. People are tired of the budget tricks. They are tired of the accounting gimmicks. They are tired of the empty promises. That is what is affecting the people of this country. They want accountability, and it is our responsibility, Mr. President, to provide it to them. People are looking for peace of mind, for good judgment, and they want people to listen to them. And yet what I see are people focused on politics on the other side of the aisle at a time when the greatest threat to our nation, to this great country, to America, is a national debt that is out of control and that it is increasing at the rate of over $4 billion a day. With that, thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts is recognized is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask simply that I be recognized to complete my comments.
Without objection.
And I would ask, there is a time, however, we have a time limit?
Democrats have the next 30 minutes.
Okay. I would ask if I could be informed when I have 5 minutes, when I have it, and at 15 minutes, if you would let me know. Thank you. Mr. President, when Harry Truman served in the seat that Senator McCaskill of Missouri holds today, he used to sit back over there in the back of the row where a lot of the newer senators sit, and he, from that vantage point, would often watch the great debates of the New Deal. And he listened long into the night, and he used to frequently write home to his wife, Bess. And one night, late after a long debate, he wrote about his experience of sitting in the Senate, this was early on, and of the awe that he felt sitting in this institution and looking across it at his colleagues, I assume imagining the ghosts of Calhoun and Clay and other great senators. And he wrote to his wife and he said, you know, I sit here in the Senate looking at this institution and at my colleagues and I pinch myself and I say, how the hell did I get here? A number of months later, it was very late at night, and he was again sitting there and he wrote to his wife And again, watching the debate, and he looked across at his colleagues and he wrote to her and he said, I asked myself, how the hell did they get here? Anyway, I suspect that at this moment in America, a lot of Americans are looking at the United States Senate, at the Congress, and they are asking a similar question, wondering whether or not we get it. Mr. President, I have enormous respect for this institution. I still believe in the phrase, the world's greatest deliberative body, which has unfortunately become a punchline in these days, but which, when we are bipartisan and serious, is still a true description, still possible when we rise to the moment. I've seen the Senate over the course of 26 years in those moments, as have other colleagues here. And I've seen it with Ted Kennedy and Bob Dole and so many others. I've seen what can be accomplished here. Regrettably, today, our allies and our enemies abroad and our friends here at home, the American citizen, are watching with either alarm and, in the case of our enemies, delight as they question America's leadership. Some abroad have even suggested that this is a sign, a moment of American decline. So even without default, believe me, just the absence of decision and the presence of partisan chaos, they are running up a huge cost for this country. Just the other day, I received a letter from 20 mayors from Massachusetts, and the letter states, the time to compromise and resolve this issue is now. And they complained that their communities were under the microscope from Moody's because we hadn't got our acts together here in Washington. Their letter was honest and eloquent, and frankly, it shouldn't be so difficult for their warnings and their example to be heeded in the Congress. The mayor's call for compromise, frankly, shouldn't be so difficult, and the call for compromise by the American people ought to be listened to and acted on, and in very short order. I've served in the majority and I've served in the minority since I've been here. I've served with Republican presidents and Democrat presidents in both situations, when we're in the minority and in the majority. I've cast tough votes in times of divided government under Republican and Democratic presidents, from Reagan to Obama. And I have never seen the governing process so broken because one faction of one side has made compromise the essence of democracy and the bedrock of our governing system, not just a dirty word, but in their view, a form of treason. The warnings of mayors were echoed yesterday by the leaders of our financial industry. Yesterday, CEOs of major financial institutions wrote, our economic recovery remains very fragile. A default on our nation's obligations or a downgrade, just a downgrade on the credit, would have an enormous impact on Americans and on investor confidence, raising interest rates for everyone who borrows, undermining the value of the dollar and rolling stock and bond markets, and therefore dramatically worsening our nation's already difficult economic circumstances. Those are their words. And notwithstanding that, we continue to see our own well-being at risk. Mr. President, this is one of those times where it is not cliche and it's not hyperbole to say that the whole world is watching, because the whole world has something at stake in what we do or don't do. And for the world, there are serious consequences in that. As chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I have heard from officials all over the world and global business leaders, and the message is always the same. They're watching in amazement, in puzzlement, and horror at what is going on in Washington. Our friends and allies whose economic fortunes and economies are linked to our own doubt us, and they're worrying about the impact of our dysfunction on their economies. And our economic rivals, believe me, our economic rivals are laughing all the way to the bank. At a time of global economic uncertainty, we should absolutely not be adding to that uncertainty by failing to resolve our debt crisis.
The International Monetary Fund is warning that actions still need to be taken to stave off contagion from Europe's sovereign debt crisis. And it's not insignificant that while Harry Reid has been busy trying to find Republicans to join Democrats in a bipartisan solution, Speaker Boehner was exclusively negotiating to end the civil war between the responsible and the unreasonable in the Republican Party. A whole day passed behind closed doors while the Speaker negotiated with Republicans to make a bad bill worse. Mr. President, I think that the distinction between what's happened in the House and the Senate is a very important one in terms of where Americans are going to find a resolution to this challenge. Here in the Senate, we have been working day and night talking with Democrat and Republican colleagues across the aisle in order to find a way forward. And for most of us, or at least many of us, certainly a sufficient number to be able to pass a solution, for them, there aren't any preconditions. Everything is on the table. But we're still facing the obstinate ideological rigidity from House Republicans, who have threatened to take our nation into default and downgrade the nation's credit rating and do even more harm to a fragile economy simply to get their way. So what is it that divides us right now? I think a lot of Americans listening to the debate probably have a serious question about, so what's the difference between these folks? What is it that divides them? Well, the Boehner plan, which was sent over here, had three fundamental problems in it that Democrats were unwilling to support. One, it had huge cuts, would force huge cuts in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid because of the structure and manner of the cuts that they were demanding. Secondly, it had a constitutional amendment provision which required that the constitutional amendment actually be passed within 6 months before the next debt limit could be raised. And because there isn't a certainty that that would happen or could happen, it meant automatic default. So the Boehner plan was setting up the United States government to go right through this exercise again and have an automatic default. And third, there was a time frame in the Boehner amendment that required us to go back and visit this in February of next year, which would have meant the minute we come back in September, the entire Congress would have been consumed with the very same thing we've been doing now, which would not give certainty to the marketplace. So it's not politics that has prevented us from proceeding forward on the Boehner plan. It was the substance of that plan. Now, the Reid plan, which we're debating right now, which is on the floor, is a plan that, because of the Republican insistence on no revenues, has no revenues. Many people on our side of the aisle object to that. But we've accepted that that's the price we need to pay as a matter of our compromise in order to get out of this crisis. So we've compromised on revenues. It has cuts, all cuts that the Republicans have already voted for, and that, again, many of our folks don't like. But they've compromised, our folks, and they've provided the cuts that the Republicans asked for. And because it has a time frame that goes until after next year, that means we will provide certainty to the marketplace and avoid a default, a downgrade of our credit. The Boehner plan would guarantee a downgrade of our credit. So these are enormous differences. And finally, the Reid plan provides a tight process, a plan that we know is familiar around here, like the way we deal with military bases. We require votes. The votes have to take place. And we would be required within a very short number of months to deal with America's long-term debt and budget crisis. And people would have an ability to put their cuts on the table, but we would also, we hope, have an opportunity to have revenues. That's the big sticking point here in the United States Senate. We need to know that if there is a trigger that is used, an automatic way in which money is going to be held back, That money has to be held back in a fair and balanced way, which means you don't just cut, you also have to have the threat of revenue, because if you don't have the threat of revenue, then the side that only wants to cut can just wait for nothing to happen, and the cuts take place automatically. There's no threat to them. There's no leverage to them to come to agreement on the other things. Now, that's reasonableness, I believe, Mr. President. I think what we're looking for here is reasonable. It is fair, and it is balanced. Now, Mr. President, the House strategy has been essentially not to negotiate. Not to negotiate. Now, we also know that there are a lot of misstatements out here. Senator Reid just corrected one a moment ago about a deal. In addition to that, we keep hearing people say that there's no plan. The President doesn't have a plan, that nothing's been reduced to writing. Well, as Senator Moynihan used to say here, anybody is entitled to their own opinion, but they are not entitled to their own facts. And the fact is that the President put a detailed plan for $4.7 trillion of cuts over 10 years, with reductions in defense and Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all on the table to find savings in those programs. And we have, it's incredible to me to keep hearing people say there's no plan when there's been plan after plan. Chairman of the Budget Committee, Conrad's been warning us for years about this. He sought to get a bipartisan deficit commission created by the Senate. It couldn't happen because the Republicans vetoed it or blocked it. So what happened? President Obama appointed one of his own. It reported back. We still haven't dealt with that. And I think there has been a great effort to move continually to deal with the Republican objections. I would ask, what is the single Republican concession? What is it that they have given as a matter of compromise? Nobody can tell you that because there hasn't been one. In fairness, in the Gang of Six, a great group of Republicans joined with Democrats, and they did make a concession, and they took political risk. And they went out and said, yes, there has to be cuts, but there also have to be revenues. And I applaud those Republicans who joined in that effort. And that's what we need to find here now. That is the way that we are going to make the difference here. The President additionally put an unprecedented $4.7 trillion on the table in his negotiations. I keep hearing people say, well, why wasn't it written down? It called for $770 billion in non-security discretionary spending cuts. It called for $400 billion in security spending cuts, $489 billion in Medicare and Medicaid savings, $360 billion in other mandatory savings, and $1 trillion from tax reform. How could I repeat this proposal if it wasn't written down? We keep hearing they didn't write it down. Mr. President, they were in the negotiations. They have pens and pencils. They have paper. They can sit there and write it down while the President says it to them. This is the most specious, ridiculous, silly, childish argument I've heard in years in the Senate. So we need to move to a different place. Mr. President, I believe that we can compromise. I think the only place to resolve this crisis is in compromise. I believe I have additional time, but I just wanted to know when I was where I am. I'll wrap up very shortly. Both houses to pass a bill. And it really shouldn't be this difficult for Congress to do its most fundamental job under the Constitution. It doesn't take an amendment to the Constitution to balance the budget. How can I say that? Because in the 1990s, we balanced the budget. We created 23 million jobs, new jobs. We raised the incomes of everybody in America. And the fact is that we did what was necessary to put us on a track to pay down the debt of our country by 2012. We sent a signal to the marketplace. Mr. President, we can do this again if we get real, if we get serious. I believe there's a bipartisan consensus here in the Senate waiting to lift our country and our future if senators are willing to sit down and forge it and make it real, if we stop talking past each other. The world's most deliberate body could become that again. But the reason it's not viewed as that today is not that the institution itself has failed. It's not that it can't be deliberative. It's because the people in it have not yet decided to live in the tradition of those predecessors who earned the reputation for this institution. It's because, unlike the years when I first came here in the 1980s, some have decided to use this institution for a 24/7, 365 days a year campaign to make everything that happens here the prisoner of ideology and politics rather than the instrument of debate and decision. I think it would do us good to remember that until recent history, this institution has been the birthplace of compromise and delivered some of the great legislative achievements that have reshaped our nation out of compromise. Bipartisan compromises here in the Senate, the passage of the Social Security Act of 1935, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the creation of Medicare in 1965, Social Security reforms of 1983. We all know that during the Constitutional Convention, Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut developed a bicameral legislative structure that broke a deadlock. And it's in the Constitution. It is why we have a Senate and a House today. Compromise. Everyone who remembers the history books remembers the Compromise of 1850, drafted by Henry Clay, that diffused a 4-year confrontation between the slave states of the South and the free states of the North. Even in our most difficult moments, we've been able to find a way to compromise. Mr. President, in the end, it is people who define this place. It's we senators. And in my conversations with colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I am convinced that there are plenty of people here who are prepared to reach across the aisle and prove that the United States and the United States Senate can live up to this moment. And I believe in the next 48 hours, the Senate will prove our ability to live up to our constitutional and our personal responsibility. Mr. President, I believe that the senator from Iowa wants to speak. Madam President, I apologize.
President, how much time do we have left?
11 minutes. The senator from Iowa.
Madam President, I'll take 11 minutes. I want to ask unanimous consent that when the time comes back on the Democratic side, that I be granted an additional 5 minutes.
Without objection.
Madam President, I'd like to remind the American people why we're in the midst of the present crisis. Days away from when the United States of America, the wealthiest nation in the world, will not be able to pay its bills. And let me be clear. The senator from Oklahoma earlier had a chart up saying we're broke, broke, broke. We are the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. We have the highest per capita income of any major nation in the world. If we're so rich, why are we so broke? Now, the issue here, despite what some may suggest, is not about new borrowing or new spending. It's about paying the bills for what we've already incurred. Yet the Republicans, after running up a huge credit card bill under George Bush, do not want to pay the bills. As every American knows, if you use your credit card, you run up debt and you have to pay the bills. And throughout American history, whether a Democratic or Republican Congress or Democratic or Republican president, that's what we as a nation have done. On this point, couldn't be more clear than this letter to Senator Howard Baker from President Ronald Reagan. The full consequences of a default, or even the serious prospect of default by the United States, are impossible and awesome to contemplate. Denigration of the full faith and credit of the United States would have substantial effects on the domestic financial markets and on the value of the dollar in exchange markets. The nation can ill afford to allow such a result. President Ronald Reagan, 1983. Can't get much clearer than that. However, today Ronald Reagan would find himself losing in a Republican Party primary because he would not be pure enough for the Tea Party. Because Republicans in the House are unwilling to do what even Ronald Reagan said needs to be done, we find ourselves in the midst of a manufactured crisis, one without precedent. One House of Congress willing to jeopardize the economy of the United States unless the country capitulates and accepts policies that otherwise do not enjoy majority support, policies that could not pass the Congress, policies that would be vetoed by the President. This is simply unprecedented. Madam President, I believe this unprecedented action requires an unprecedented response. As at other critical junctures in our history, the President must act boldly to protect our Constitution and, more importantly, our country. Madam President, the Constitution never envisioned that one House of Congress would willingly destroy the United States economy in order to obtain policy objectives it could not achieve through the normal legislative process. Yet that's the situation our nation finds itself in. The legislative process is hard. It's frustrating. Trust me, there are many ideas and proposals that I have fought my entire career on to become law. And they never are like I envisioned started out, because you make compromises along the way. Yet rather than engaging in the hard work of persuading the American people, persuading a majority of the House, persuading a majority of the Senate, persuading the President, a task which often takes years and multiple elections, the House Republicans want to short-circuit the legislative process by holding the economy hostage. For example, if the Republicans in the House put forth a bill to eliminate Medicare, it wouldn't get anywhere. Yet, with their cut, cap, and balanced budget amendment, it would shrink the government to the size it was prior to Medicare even taking hold. And that would mean that we would have to do away with Medicare. However, that could never pass here on its own. Likewise, I read that Speaker Boehner recently suggested to the President that the House would vote to allow the United States to pay its bills if the President would agree to repeal health care reform. In other words, take away health insurance from 30 million Americans and allow health insurance companies to deny coverage based on pre-existing conditions. Now, the House could never achieve these policy objectives through the normal process, so they hold the economy hostage. Think about that. Now, Madam President, this is not just the attitude of the Republican Party with respect to the debt limit. The Republican Party has adopted an entirely new approach to democracy that is wholly undemocratic. If they cannot win elections or win the court of public opinion, they insist on holding the country hostage. The minority leader has been frank about this approach to governing. In a recent speech about a balanced budget amendment, the minority leader of the U.S. Senate, the Republican leader, said the following, and I quote, "The time has come for a balanced budget amendment that forces Washington to balance its books. The Constitution must be amended to keep the government in check. We've tried persuasion, we've tried negotiations, we've tried elections, nothing has worked." Say again? Say again? We've tried elections and nothing has worked? What is he implying? Furthermore, I would say to the Republican leader, we had surpluses in 98 and 99 and 2000 and 2001. We had 4 years of surpluses. And yet somehow we've tried elections and nothing's worked? Is he implying that somehow we need to have another course of action outside of elections, outside of persuasion, outside of negotiation? President Bush's former speechwriter, David Frum, recently commented on the increasingly absurd and unrealistic demands put forth by House Republicans before they agree not to destroy the American economy. He noted, quote, "Why doesn't the new Boehner bill just require Obama to resign in favor of a Republican before the second debt ceiling increase? Tidier." End quote. Sadly, that's not too far from the truth. In the face of this radical, and cynical approach to governing, we're faced with a manufactured crisis. Indeed, the ramifications for our economy, for our middle class, indeed for America's ability to trust and believe in their government, the stakes could not be higher. In response, in the absence of a balanced approach that could be agreed upon broadly in the Senate and the House, I believe the President must act boldly. He must carry out his constitutional duty to honor the commitments the United States government has made. I believe the President, under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, must honor the obligations of the United States government. As the Supreme Court noted in Perry v. U.S., Chief Justice Hughes' opinion, the 14th Amendment, in its fourth section, explicitly declares the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law shall not be questioned. While this provision was undoubtedly inspired by the desire to put beyond question the obligations of the government issued during the Civil War, its language indicates a broader connotation. Chief Justice Hughes goes on to say, the Constitution gives to the Congress the power to borrow money on the credit of the United States, an unqualified power, a power vital to the government, upon which, in an extremity, its very life may depend. The binding quality of the promise of the United States is of the essence of the credit which is so pledged. Having this power to authorize the issue of definite obligations for the payment of money borrowed, listen to this, the Congress has not been vested with authority to alter or destroy those obligations. One more time. Congress has unlimited power to borrow, but the Congress has not been vested with authority to alter or destroy the obligations. I don't think it could be more clear. It could not be more clear. Congress has not been vested with the authority to alter or destroy the nation's credit obligations. Of course, that means that Congress cannot, through its actions, repudiate the nation's debt. But it also means, through its inaction, failing to raise the debt ceiling, it cannot repudiate our country's obligations. Thus, rather than somehow prohibiting the President from taking action to protect the full faith and credit of the United States, as some have suggested, I believe the clear reading of the 14th Amendment, as supported by Perry v. United States, I believe the President is obligated to ensure that, in the words of the 14th Amendment, the public debt not be questioned. I know that legal scholars have spent some time in recent weeks debating the meaning of the 14th Amendment with respect to the debt ceiling. But, Madam President, where there is debate on the meaning of the Constitution, where there is no precedent, where the courts have not weighed in, where under our system of government we can't just walk across the street to the Supreme Court and ask them for an advisory opinion, I want to remind the President that the Constitution does not belong to law professors. It does not belong to political pundits. It does not belong to columnists. Rather, it belongs to the American people. And you, Mr. President, have been entrusted by the American people in a very clear election to, as it says right here in the Constitution, to faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and, to the best of your ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So, Mr. President, the 14th Amendment makes clear the full faith and credit of the United States cannot be destroyed. The only case on point ever decided by the Supreme Court said that Congress cannot alter or destroy those obligations. Cannot. So if the Congress, through inaction or action, tries to destroy or alter those obligations, I believe it is incumbent upon the Chief Executive to exercise his authority, to make sure that the full faith and credit of the United States is not jeopardized. The President should use his authority to do so. And I will give you 3 examples where there is no precedence, where there's no clear authority in the Constitution, but where the President exercised that kind of authority. Thomas Jefferson, purchasing the Louisiana Purchase. He wrote letters, and I have them here, and I'm going to ask that they be submitted at this point in the record.
Without objection.
Thomas Jefferson's letters to Senator Breckinridge, where he agonized over whether he as president had the authority under the Constitution to consummate the treaty for the purchase of Louisiana territory. But in the end, and he even said in his letter, perhaps we need a constitutional amendment to go through the Congress and go to the states and be ratified before I can do this. But in the end, he realized that that would take a long time. It might fall through. All kinds of bad things would happen. And even one of the framers of our Constitution, Thomas Jefferson, took action even though there was no clear authority in the Constitution for him to do so. In fact, members of the House went after him for it. But he decided that it was better, as he said, to ensure the future benefits of the United States rather than some minor violation of the Constitution. Second example, President Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation. There was no authority for him to do that. No authority whatsoever. But he did it. He did it, even though some people at that time went after him because he did not have the clear authority in the Constitution to do so. Third example, Franklin Roosevelt, Lend-Lease. The Lend-Lease program to Great Britain to make sure that they could fight off the Nazi invasion of Great Britain, a clear success. Franklin Roosevelt wrote that he didn't think this was probably constitutional. But he instructed his Attorney General. He gave his own Attorney General a legal opinion from the President saying that the country needed to have this done. And he went ahead and did it. And again, some people took after him on it, but we all realized it was the right thing to do for the survival of our own country. Well, those are just three instances. There are more, but those are three big ones, where, again, no clear authority by the Constitution, but no prohibition in the Constitution for the President to do so, and where the vital security of the United States was at stake. Madam President, I'll close on this. I believe this is just like those times. The security, the future improvement of the United States, and future generations depend upon the President taking this action boldly and forthrightly to preserve the integrity and to make sure that the obligations and the full faith and credit of the United States is not questioned. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Indiana.
Madam President, thank you. I wonder if I could ask how much time is allocated. I know we're a little out of kilter here with the allocation of time. How much time do I have to speak? And I want to make sure my colleagues have sufficient time to speak also.
Under the previous order, the Republicans control the next 24 minutes.
All right. I will not begin to use that amount of time. I think I can use 10 or less and then leave some time for my colleagues. I can't count how many times I've been here pretty much speaking about the same subject, but it's a subject that, of course, occupies all of us, and it has for this entire session of the United States Congress. 3 days are left until we reach that date at which the White House has said, and the Treasury has said, we default on our obligations. Right now, we are debating on a Saturday night over a bill that's already been defeated in the Senate by a very substantial vote, including with Democrat support, debating a bill that we know will not pass here. The irony of being charged with filibustering the majority leader's bill, the Reid bill, is somewhat bizarre given the fact that Republicans are willing to give Senator Reid and Democrats a vote on this bill as soon as they want it. None of it, it's been going on now for many, many hours. I think everything that can be said for or against has probably been said, but nevertheless, the majority leader himself objected to our offer to stop talking on both sides and get to the vote for whatever reason, but that's where we are. Madam President, I've been talking for some time now about the fact that the current fiscal crisis which the United States is in demands that we as a Congress seriously recognize the enormity of the problem and come forward with a bold plan to begin to address over a period of time what is necessary to do to assure financial markets and to assure the American people that we understand the plight that we're in, that we have taken not only rational steps but significant steps to address the problem that we're in, and that we're ready to put bold plans in place to get us on the path to fiscal health. Yet here we are after months of debate, debating over a small step forward, which in my opinion will not begin to satisfy all of those who are concerned about whether or not we truly grasp what is necessary to be done and truly send a signal to the financial world and to the world itself and to the American people that we have taken the necessary step to put our country on the right fiscal path. Now, it's clear, and it's been said so many times, but I want to just repeat it. Our spending addiction over a period of years, which has become much worse in the last 2.5 years, with a 24% increase in spending under the Obama administration, with a staggering increase in the debt from $10.6 trillion on Inauguration Day to $14.3 trillion today, a $3.7 trillion increase in just a 2-year period of time, maybe a 2.5-year period of time. Clearly, those attempts to address our economy haven't succeeded. The President's stimulus plan cost an additional $862 billion, and we clearly haven't gotten stimulus because the latest reports are almost staggering to all of us as we find out that our growth in the first quarter of this year was far under what had been projected and had been calculated initially. Unemployment is not going down. People are out of work. Clearly, we need to make significant strides forward. I won't go into all the details of the flaws of the Reid plan. It's been talked about here by a number of people and soundly rejected by the House. We know it's not going to achieve the necessary number of votes to go forward, but here we are debating it. But I really want to talk about the larger question. And the larger question is, are we going to take significant steps to put us on the right track? Are we going to compromise to the point where the rating agencies, the financial world, and even the American people look at it and say, is that it? Is that all you can do? Now, what's interesting here is that it's talked about the last few, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle talked about a compromise. Let's move to the middle on this sort of thing. But it's like taking a scale of 10 and reducing it down to 4. And so instead of being 5 on a scale of 10, now we lower the top line to 4 and say we need to get down to 2 or to 1.5. And you were not willing to go that far, and so therefore you're not willing to compromise. That's distorted logic. But more importantly, it is logic or illogic that is driving us to an incomplete solution to a very real problem. You know, it doesn't take much to understand how this is being viewed. Just in the last couple of days, the New York Times runs a headline basically saying, recovery still slow and new data show little growth ahead. Washington Post has a headline, The Stranglehold on Our Domestic Policy, written by Michael Gerson, who used to be one of my staff members. Robert Samuelson, why are we in this debt fix? We have to address health care spending. U.S. GDP grows just 1.3%, Wall Street Journal. And on it goes. My own view of this, which is not because I'm a brilliant economist, I'm not, And not because I'm a financial analyst, I'm not. But I have talked to dozens and more of people who don't have a political skin in the game, but simply have analyzed this in a objective way and indicated that unless we come forward with something close to, actually something above, a $4 trillion limit in spending reductions over a decade, combined with a path to entitlement programs restructuring and curbing the excessive mandatory spending, combined with an overhaul of our complicated tax code to make American businesses more competitive and spur economic growth, we will not be addressing the problem. So the problem here is that too many people are thinking if we just end up with this compromise, if one side or the other side will move just a little bit and we end up with this compromise, we will be able to avoid default on the debt limit, and we will have addressed the problem. And for those who say, well, no, it's step one, and we can address it in step two, the balance that we weren't able to do here, I don't think the American people have much confidence in that when we come forward and say we will have a group of senators and congressmen on a divided basis between Republicans and Democrats sit down and then report something to us, and that'll solve the problem. And the difficulty there is that that's the same people here who haven't been able to solve it in 7 months of debate, sometimes with Democrats and Republicans engaging in those debates. I don't think it's going to be solved because we may arrive very much at the same stalemate that we've risen after this 7 months of debate, partly because there are two visions in place here. I think what this is all about is what is the proper role of the federal government, and what can the federal government afford to do and not afford to do? On the one hand, we have people that say the government has grown too big. Republicans are saying we can't afford it anymore. It is hurting the economy. It's a vision for the future that is very, very different from our colleagues across the aisle who basically see government as much more engaged in the process and don't want to cut back on a number of programs and a number of initiatives and a number of policies that have been put in place over a number of years. And it's not quite that clearly divided by this aisle. There are people on both sides that have shades of one way or shades of the other way. But the reality is, if we look around the world and we look at models as to what makes economies flourish and what makes governments financially stable, we see that an overgrowth of promises, an overpromising parliaments and congresses, finally brings us to the point we no longer can afford what we have promised people, and that's where we are now. And so without putting those practices in place, I fear that whatever we do won't be sufficient. We'll get the downgrade anyway, and we may get a precipitous action that puts us in a far different, a more difficult situation than it would have been had we come forward with something significant now, at a level at which those who are analyzing this say they've got it, they're serious about it, they've locked it in, they've made sure it can't be overturned, and this is where we're going, and we have injected certainty into the future. Even though some of that certainty is painful, it will be rewarded, I believe, with support because it is sufficient to take the necessary first step. Now, knowing 3 days away, we're 3 days away from default, I propose that if we can't come to an agreement on something of sufficient size, we should provide an extension, short-term, whether it's 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, a short-term extension, guarantee that we won't default, put the amount of money on the increase in return for, on the increase in the debt ceiling in return for equivalent amount of spending cuts, and give us some time to come together and do what I have outlined here, or something close to what I've outlined here, so that in the end we do not have an immediate default. We do have a commitment to go forward and put something of substance in place and give it one last shot. Maybe I'm a starry-eyed optimist. Maybe I'm just hoping that whatever we do here can be built upon and brought to the point where it will become effective rather than fearing that what we do will be relegated as a step far too short to address the problems of our time. Madam President, I wish we had done more. I think we still can do more, but decisions have to be made in a very quick matter of time here. But whatever we do, and even if we end up passing something that's insufficient, I hope we will start to work the very next day on addressing the real problems that we face and putting something in place that will restore confidence that America is not going to become a second-rate nation, that we are not going to see a devaluation of our dollar, we're not going to see a loss of confidence in the American people and investors and the world in terms of this is the place to do business, to live, to prosper, to have a safe haven for your funds. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,